A lot of atheists today think that souls don't exist, that we just are our physical brains. So in this video, I've invited an expert to answer the top 10 objections to dualism. Dualism is the view that there are two types of substances, so physical things like bodies, and then mental things like souls. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through these objections rapid fire style. So Dr. Farris, I'm only giving him 60 seconds to answer each objection. Let's go ahead and start with the first one, the interaction problem. Critics argue that dualism struggles to explain how the immaterial mind and the material body interact, such as how mental events can cause physical actions. How do you respond to this one?
Great. Well, in short, the answer to the objection is there is no interaction problem. And I think this is as philosophers have said, the most overrated objection to position in the history of philosophy. And that's because once we take seriously the mind, mental events, mental properties, they are non-reducible to physical and neural properties. And so you have to make sense of the bridge already between these events and properties. So what's a problem for all is a problem for none. And this applies to dualism.
Okay, so number 2, Occam's razor. Some philosophers contend that dualism introduces unnecessary complexity by positing two fundamental substances when a monist approach, like physicalism, could explain the same phenomena with just one.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting objection, and it seems to be motivated by an intuition itself. But the question is, can it actually capture all the phenomena? Can it make sense of all the phenomena? That's the real question. If it doesn't, then this sort of Occam's razor or principle of simplicity doesn't actually apply or justify or make sense of physicalism or some version of monism being a better alternative to dualism. And I would suggest, based upon the features of qualia, the features of intentionality, the privacy of the mental, that these monist views do not make sense of those. And so this objection doesn't really hold water against dualism.
So by the way, while we're limiting Dr. Farris to 60-second responses for the purposes of this video, if you're interested, he's provided much longer responses to these objections at the link in the description. With that, let's go ahead and move on to number 3, lack of empirical evidence. So this objection says that dualism is criticized for lacking empirical evidence that can support the existence of immaterial minds or souls. So you got no evidence.
This is an interesting objection, but I think it confronts the problem of out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences, of which we have numerous accounts and reports for, that logically, if they're true, presuppose something like a soul, something other than the body, that makes my existence or me persist beyond the body itself. And it furthermore raises the question about the adequacy of empirical science as the primary or only means by which we can arrive at truth and knowledge about the truth. On both accounts, I think dualism does a better job of accounting for the fact of rational truths as well as the fact of out-of-body experiences.
So objection number 4, dependency on the brain. This is a big one. Evidence from neuroscience suggests that mental processes and consciousness are closely tied to brain activity, challenging dualist separation of mind and body. What is your response?
This is one of the reasons advanced in favor of some form of monism, and I think it's an intuitive sort of objection. But I think it only works if we assume that the mind isn't real, that we eliminate the mind, or we assume some sort of identity physicalist thesis that minds literally are identical to brain states or neural events. But neuroscientists themselves don't even make that assumption. They presume some kind of dualism, oftentimes in their writings about neural events and mental events, as if they are simply distinct. Certainly there are different types of or notions of dependence of the mind on the brain, that would commonsensically make sense of the fact that brain effects actually do impact the mind itself or the soul, like when I hit my head on the dashboard of the car upon a collision with another car. This makes sense of that fact if I have a view of mind on brain dependence. But that's true on both physicalism as well as dualism. So at the end of the day, I don't think this is really an objection to dualism.
So let me also mention that Dr. Farris recently wrote a book, Defending the Soul, that you guys can pick up. I've got it linked in the description. It's called, let me see if I can get the camera to focus on it. There it is, The Creation of Self, A Case for the Soul, Joshua Farris. Really good book. Highly recommend you guys pick that up. All right, let's move on to number 5. Problem of causal closures. I see this on X a lot. Physicalism proponents argue that if everything has a physical cause, dualism's non-physical mind would be unable to influence the physical world. So how do you respond to the idea of causal closure?
Kim says, quote, any physical event that has a cause at time t has a physical cause at time t, end quote. But this, of course, raises the question about the natural world and whether or not it's closed, and everything is comprehensively explained by physical events, laws, and underlying physical particles. I doubt that. I reject that thesis, and I think for the reasons that, well, in fact, we do have reasons, and our minds have access to those reasons that transcend physical explanations in the world. In other words, naturalism is an insufficient explanation for all that's going on in the world, and we need minds and we need reasons. But if those are true and they're not deterministically caused, then something else is going on beyond the principle of physical causal closure that explains all that occurs in the world.
So number 6 is actually probably one of the most interesting objections, in my view, to dualism. It's called Evolutionary Perspective. So basically, critics argue that dualism doesn't align well with our understanding of human evolution and the development of consciousness. So how do you respond to that?
So what's the real concern here? Is it the idea that the churchlings have stated that ghosts, disembodied spirits, angels, gods, things of these sorts are spooky forces that have no place in a scientific picture of the world? Is that the concern? Well, then I would just suggest that there's probably more going on than the scientific picture that they've assumed. Is it the concern of the principle of physical causal closure? We've already dealt with that. I think there's more to be said here about the fittingness, maybe. Maybe that's the concern. How is it that souls fit in biological evolution? And I think basically we have no good reason, no a priori reason or empirical reason for rejecting something like psychophysical laws, that there are actually laws that govern the interaction of minds with bodies. And if we don't have any good reasons to reject that interaction, then it doesn't seem like there's any good reason to reject dualism as incompatible with an evolutionary perspective.
All right, objection number 7, problem of identity. So dualism faces questions regarding the identity of the mind and soul over time, especially in cases of amnesia, brain damage, or other mental disorders.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. There's a lot of data on this, and I would just push back and say that these are complex, challenging concerns for both the physicalist as well as the dualist. But if dualism is true and the identity of persons is predicated of some simple thing, then dualism supplies a kind of natural explanation as to how it is that I could exist or persist, even though the complexities of my body and my brain change over time. And we know that. We can look at brain damage. We can look at amnesia, as well as other cases like dementia. But this doesn't really seem to undermine dualism. It just provides a complicated case for both physicalists and dualists. Certainly, if we have a robust view of mind-on-brain dependence or functional dependence, then we can make sense of the fact that there is such a thing as physical malfunctioning, brain malfunctioning, that actually affects the structure of the mind itself and how it is that we experience the world. This isn't really a problem.
So objection number 8, we've got 3 more. Problem of other minds. It's challenging to verify the existence of other minds or souls, leading to skepticism about dualism's claims.
The problem of other minds is not a metaphysical problem or objection. The fact that I have access to my own mental states and you have access to your own mental states and you don't have direct access to my mental states, it doesn't seem to be a problem. Now, it might be an epistemic concern or challenge that I don't or I lack certain reasons or justification that other minds exist, but there's different ways to respond. One is just to say that, well, it's an inference to the best explanation based upon your communication, your behavior, that you are a mind or have a mind. The other way is just to respond that commonsensically, when my cognitive faculties are reliably functioning, they just do produce the belief that you are a mind or that you have a mind, and that seems sufficient. The fact that I have a second personal encounter, a meaningful encounter with another person, seems sufficient for the belief or for the justification that I know that you are, in fact, a person.
All right, so number 9 is another one of these really interesting objections. So it's the problem of location. Dualism struggles to explain where the mind or soul is located or how it relates to specific parts of the body. Just to kind of expand on that one a little bit, this one isn't in our notes, but there's a mutual friend of ours, Parker Sedecase, and he often likes to ask the question, could God have put my soul into my desk? And that's sort of related here, the problem of location. How do you respond?
This may be a problem of conceivability, but there seems to be a more fundamental or deeper metaphysical issue that David Hume raises about the nature of causation in the world. Why is it that the billiard ball hits another billiard ball? What's the causal relation? Is it a brute cause? Is it a brute force? Or is it some just sort of causally contiguous relation? This is a problem for both physicalists as well as dualists. And dualists do have other things to say about this. They do have other things to say about why it is that this soul is spatial or causally efficacious in this spatial location. One is just to say that there's a brute, singular, or basic relation that my soul has to my body, and that's sufficient. God set it up that way. That's all we need to say. Other dualists have different answers. Some would say that the soul is actually located. It's located in this body. It's simple. It's not spatially extended, but nonetheless it is spatial, and this deflates the concerns or the conceivability of how this soul could causally interact with this body at this place.
So before moving on to the very last objection we're covering in this video, there's just wanted to give you a quick reminder to go like and subscribe to the channel. And then if you want to support us, links to our Patreon are in the description. All right, so number 10 is lack of a coherent explanation. So some people argue that dualism doesn't provide a sort of satisfactory explanation for various mental phenomena like memory, emotions, and perception. How do you respond?
Yeah, this is quite a complicated set of issues, and I would say that it's quite complicated for both monists as well as dualists of varying brands. But I would also push back and say that dualists have done some work on this. Dualists have tried to make sense of both memory and perception in various ways. Certainly, Neo-Aristotelian and Thomist dualists have tried to provide an account where there's an intermediary relation, a teleocausal relation between matter and form that would undergird and make sense of the unity between neural events that bring about memories and the soul structure itself. There's also other accounts, soul-body accounts, like emergentist accounts that would seem to provide maybe some similar explanation as to how these work together. One famous article that I'm reminded of is Howard Robinson's quite complicated and sophisticated theory of embodiment called A Dualist Account of Embodiment in the Case of for Dualism back in 1989. I would encourage the reader to look at that. All that to say that I think, honestly, there's a lot of work to be done, whether you're a monist or a dualist, on these particular issues.